here in the perimeter, there are no stars. Out here, we is stoned, immaculate.
Hello and welcome. This is the C86 show. I'm David Eastaugh. As you know, we love a special guest. This week it's going to be the turn of the singer, songwriter, guitarist and author. It is Miki Berenyi, one-time member of Lush, and is now in the band Piroshka. She's got a book out titled Fingers Crossed. This is going to be out on 9/8 Books at the end of September 2022. It's a classic, so check it out and buy it. This is the interview, so we're going to get right down to it. So after several minutes of interest and casual chat, we got down to the reason for writing the book now. Miki's going to tell you more and lots of other stuff, so do take notes. Anyway, Miki, tell us about writing this book. It's over to you.
I think what happened was because I was before, like when Lush were going, and even with the reunion, I wasn't on social media at all, right? So when I started Piroshka, I thought, well, I'm going to have to get, we've got to have some sort of social media profile. So I started posting kind of bit cynically, putting Lush pictures up and stuff from the past with little anecdotes and things. So as I built up a following, I was getting loads of people going, oh, you should write a book, and that was kind of a constant. And I was like, yeah, that's not going to happen. But then I think with, basically I got approached by the publisher who was setting up this 9/8 Books at Bonnier. So he was actually looking for a roster of kind of, first year of this imprint. So he approached me and I was like, initially just thought, God, no way, I'm just not interested. But then I kind of lost my job, and then lockdown was like fast approaching.
Yes.
And I just thought, all right, well, maybe I'll have a crack at it. But I had to think about it for quite a long time. And I did sort of, because I just thought I've never done, the thought of writing a whole bloody book was just really daunting. I'm not a writer. I've been a sub-editor, but that's not the same thing at all. And and I just was quite worried because, I don't talk to Emma or Phil anymore. It's quite tricky to be writing about a period that, they were so heavily involved in. I'm aware of how difficult that can be on the person being written about, especially when you don't talk to them anymore. So there's clearly some animosity there, and I wasn't really interested in writing. I did say from the outset, I'm not really interested in writing some sort of high times of rock and roll and my fabulous life in Lush. It's just, that just really doesn't interest me. But as I started writing a lot of the childhood stuff, I got kind of really immersed in that. And then I think, Peter was like, actually go with this because it's really good. So over half the book is before even Lush.
Yes, well, absolutely. That's the bit that I suppose gives it such a lot of gravitas, really, because you do go into such detail, and your family my God, your family, you didn't have a great childhood, did you? It's not a happy story at all. Even the mention of the Wombles doesn't bring that much happiness.
I hope it doesn't sound too grim, because I think there was some kind of it was more extreme than anything. Look, I know my parents split up and there was all sorts of disruption and neglect, and there was, abuse or whatever. And I'm not minimizing that. But at the same time, I was from quite a middle class background. There were certain privileges. My parents are really fucking good fun, right? They are absolutely, really interesting people. So there's a kind of like, it's the sort of two extremes of it. I wouldn't, if anyone said to me like, God, would you have rather have grown up in a completely different environment? I think, well, yeah, there's bits that I could have done without, but at the same time, that's kind of what happens to you, isn't it? Like you just get through that crap and it makes you the person that you are.
Yes. Well, it is, yeah, I guess so. It is kind of extreme, and then you're sort of the role of the band as well, and how you go into that. So when you were writing about your childhood, had you buried quite a lot of that stuff that you started to sort of unpick, or was it still very fresh in your mind? Because obviously you went from childhood to being in a band, which again isn't really very good for your health on any certain level. So was that kind of material that you'd slightly forgot about, or I just wondered if, as the writing process began, you suddenly began
To be
to.
honest, not really, because I talk a lot about that and have done over the years. Do you know what I mean? I do sort of, lots of my friends know about my background and I have chat, but there were bits where I had to suddenly think, actually, this isn't just an anecdote. I need to be really honest about some of this stuff. So I think that kind of surface more, but I'm used to talking about my mad parents and some of the sort of more extremes of what my childhood involved with close friends and boyfriends, things like that. So it wasn't like I was sort of opening up some dusty box and thinking, oh my god, you know what I mean,
Yeah.
what happened to me. It was more about trying to write it in a way that didn't sound too pity me, that conveyed what was actually sometimes just quite a fun and exciting life as well. And and I don't know, I actually sort of find writing about other people more interesting, so trying to convey what these sort of personalities in my life were like, which I hope I've achieved, because it's as much about what fascinating people they were.
Yes. I mean, an amazing story, but both your parents and then your step parents, and Nora appears. I mean, for someone who's so young, you did very well to sort of maneuver through those kind of issues, and then sort of a life in London, a bit of a life in LA, and school as well, which is never that easy either. So, and during that period, because some of the language you use about sort of, which kind of all comes back about what kids would talk to, how they would talk to each other. It's kind of like, wow, yes, of course, I remember that sort of world of. I think the only thing you didn't mention was Four Eyes. That was the other one. Any kid with glasses always got insulted as well, didn't you? But you got all the others in there.
I think I mentioned that somewhere else, just being called that myself because I was wearing glasses. I mean, I think, and I get that, the times then were, it was pretty racist, do you know what I mean? And people didn't see any harm in kind of being racist, because I think it was all over the telly as well, all sorts of slanderous terms were just used. But I think, like I say in the book, there's so many insults. Everyone's insulted. It's not just race. It's weight, it's intellect, it's, boys being called, puffs, and girls being called lesbo, and you know what I mean? It's like, whatever. You couldn't exist without having some sort of, rubbish attached to you. So it didn't feel like, oh, everyone else gets off scot-free.
Yes, this is true.
The kind of few sort of different raced people get like absolutely harangued. It just wasn't like that. And there's a bit of me that doesn't. I do worry sometimes about sort of over dramatizing the effect of some of those sort of things. Yeah, it wasn't great. Do you know what I mean? But I never personally suffered, really terrible sort of racism of being kind of excluded or looked down on or anything like that. I'm sure plenty did, but I just wanted to sort of paint a whole picture.
I know. Well, I think, yes. I mean, sometimes, yeah, some people suffer worse than others. So when you were growing up, did you ever want to be in a band? Was that one of your dreams? Because you sort of talk about getting, listening to music and sort of obviously going to a lot of gigs. But, the introduction of a musical instrument and thinking, yes, I'm not going to just be a fan. I'm going to go onto the stage. Was that ever a dream during the 70s?
Not really. I mean, I think my mum, was in acting. So, that always seemed like, oh, maybe I could become an actress. But to be honest, I kind of faded out with that quite quickly, because I just realised in the way that she was typecast. And, being an actor is so reliant on, the point you have to reach to actually be able to do what you want to do and actually be in something, just requires so much hoop jumping that I don't think I could have taken the rejection. I was quite aware of that. Whereas being in a band, you've just got that control. Even if you don't get anywhere, you write the songs, you perform them. Do you know what I mean? No one's kind of testing you to see if you can even be a part of it. And I think, as much as I would have dreamed of, like, would have been great to have been, Debbie Harry or even Poison Ivy playing bass in the Cramps, I'd be like, oh my God, that would be amazing. But it just seemed a completely unattainable goal. So it really wasn't until I started going to gigs and then seeing smaller and smaller and smaller bands where you realise that, well, there's some support band at the Hope and Anchor and there's 40 people here. They're not very good, but they look like they're having a really good laugh. And I think that's where me and Emma felt, well, I think we could have a crack at that. I mean, you know what I mean? So I do think the sort of overspill of punk rock with that kind of anyone can have a go, that was more the inspiration. And it was also a scene that we were involved in. We were going to like 5 gigs a week, and gigs back then were like £1 to get in or something.
Yes.
And, we were immersed in that scene and everyone was in a band. Everyone was in a band. You know what I mean?
Yes, I think there will be a musical, isn't there? Camden, the musical, will come out. Or I think, is it Charles? Well, here's the poet. There's the punk poet who's going to do, is it Rehab, the musical or something that's based on Britpop? I don't know.
Oh God, really?
Yes, I can't remember his name now, but remember the £1 Million Poet who came out, and I have got the book somewhere near me, but not that close. Yes, not Charles Shaw Murray, but the other guy who's got a very beautiful voice and talks. He used to support people like My Life Story for a while and got the £1 Million, and it was like, wow, that's amazing. And then it all goes terribly wrong, as all these things do. But I think he's doing Rehab the musical, which I thought was based a little bit on Britpop. I might be making all that. That might have been just a dream. But then you were in a small band, Bugs, weren't you? And then Lush. At that stage, did you sort of, because obviously, as you mentioned, the Smiths in 83, because the indie pop world, 83 to 87, it was a glorious period, wasn't it? The Smiths, and then 87, they split up, then Ecstasy comes along, and the musical landscape changes quite a bit. What was it like forming a band during that period? Because it was just, things were shifting quite a lot during that end of the decade, wasn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I think in the kind of 80s, pre-Lush forming, it was very vibrant. I don't think we realised at the time, when you're born into this scene, you just think it's like that all the time. You don't really appreciate that this might just be a moment. So being able to see, as I say, the Smiths in Norwich in 1983 with just 50 people there, and it's a laugh. We didn't have to buy tickets like 3 months in advance. And,
no.
You could just rock up on the night and decide if you wanted to go. And it was just all a bit looser. There was always gigs on. There was gigs every night. Cheap beer. It was built for like a massive amount of unemployed people at the time. And there was this really thriving kind of scene. College, sort of student gigs where it was again really cheap, subsidized bus. So even though you didn't have any money, there was a whole kind of entertainment structure there. I mean, you just wouldn't be able to do that now, paying 28 quid for a gig and drinks are like 8 quid. I mean, forget it. Do you know what I mean?
Yes, absolutely. No,
at the time it was really built for people who had no money. That's what it was for.
Well, the great thing with the book is that you mentioned so many bits from our childhood, from Stig of the Dump, which was a classic, isn't it, to Job Seekers Allowance, which was also the Enterprise Allowance Scheme, I think you mentioned. So a lot of the bands from that 80s period and probably into the 90s had, unemployment, which wasn't it wasn't ever looked upon as a bad thing. It was like almost a sort of career move, wasn't it? Just go unemployed, get your job seekers allowance or whatever, get your housing benefit, council tax and £40 in the bank. It was positively living the high life. So it did encourage a lot of people to have a go for a year or two, because it was like, well, there's not much else happening in Thatcher's Britain. So it was a perfect time for you and the band. And also, as you mentioned, the gatekeep, or kind of in slightly the gatekeepers, because you had every city and town had an alternative indie night, didn't they? And then you had John Peel, and then you had 3 weekly music papers with huge circulation. So it didn't take much to suddenly get a bit of traction going, blimey, people know us in other places, which was great. And Lush just did take off. You were the kind of the perfect band really at that time.
I mean, we weren't. We were pretty ropey. We were really not great musicians. I mean, Chris was a really good drummer. And Muriel, when she was singing with us before I took over, I mean, she had a really lovely voice. But, we were just quite under-rehearsed. We weren't very competent. We were still learning. We were still writing our first songs and trying to make the dust settle on the band. So things happened very quickly. And I think it was even signing to 4AD that, it was suddenly like just everything sped up really quickly. Because I mean, I think I played my first gig as singer so it was the four of us around the end of kind of, would it have been 88? And by the following summer, we were signed to 4AD. I mean, literally barely been going, you know what I mean? It's not like, I think back then, if you came from Norwich or somewhere more regional, you had a chance to sort of be the local band and play for a bit before there was any press interest or labels. It took a while to sort of build that up for yourself, but it gave you the chance to actually get quite good, before you even thought of playing a London show. Well, of course, London was where we lived. So all our shows were in London. Emma was working with Jeff Barrett, who did the press for kind of Creation and Factory. So the second we played our first gig, it was like people from the industry were sort of around and journalists. So it was just really, really rapid. And that was great in one respect, because I do wonder, we were in our last year at North London Poly, and I do wonder whether Chris would have gone back up north. Everyone would have drifted off because they would have had to get jobs.
Yes.
So it was literally me and Chris and Steve did our finals at North London Poly, and literally we went from that to recording Scar that summer. So although it was a bit quick in that we were probably not quite deserving of the attention we were getting at that point, at the same time, maybe it wouldn't have happened if it hadn't. Do you know what I mean? Maybe Lush just wouldn't have gone on after that.
I think with all bands that make it, obviously we don't really hear the ones who don't. There is this kind of almost the stars do line up, don't they, in that brief moment. And it's like, oh my goodness, it's going to happen. Whereas sometimes it's just like, no, that didn't quite happen. That's a shame. But it's amazing how fragile it is when you look back at the way most bands form, and the fact that they get that little break and then they start moving a little bit forward. Because there's obviously, it is a lot of chance meetings and a bit of luck, but obviously you've got to be there at the right time to make it happen.
I think it's also the environment. I do think that it's sort of, being a student back then even, and getting a grant, and we weren't living like millionaires. Most people were squatting and they were living in really crappy sort of rental accommodation. You didn't have much money at all to spend, but like I say, that environment, cheap gigs, you could get by, and it bought you a couple of years to sort of think, well, to at least have a go. And I'm not sure that environment exists anymore. Because and it sounds bad, like, oh my god, you were just sponging off the dole and whatever, but in a political sense, I would argue that a lot of these people went on to generate a lot of tax money.
Yes.
You know what I mean? People did actually go on to form careers from having that breathing space to actually make, to start off, whether they're promoters, whether they're, kind of journalists, whether they became bands or sound engineers or studio producers, all of that kind of, sort of was born out of that very vibrant kind of creative scene where there just wasn't much money about. And okay, you signed on for a bit, but I think it actually was, a really positive thing. And plenty of people I knew who were in bands were like, they did it for a year and then they went off and became a doctor, or, they went on to very, very good careers.
Yes, absolutely. No, I met a few people who we were squatting in London. I think this was a member of Thatcher on Acid. And he said, oh yeah, I was still doing my degree and I became a GP eventually, but you're squatting. Then one of the main things is that you didn't end up with any debt. You may not have had money, but you didn't have any debt, which was like, exactly. Okay, I've got a clear start. So I don't have any a bill or interest rates to pay, which I think is such a relief. And luckily at that age, you probably still vaguely got your health. So one thing that's really boggling in the book, and it did make me laugh, kind of coming from sort of East Anglia, but you always seem to sort of meet quite, even on your way up, quite famous people and famous boyfriends and stuff like that. And it's like, It's like, you all there was, everyone seemed to be, kind of, oh yes, they're famous. Oh, they're even more famous. Oh, they were famous. So it's quite amazing that kind of. Did you smile when you were writing some of the, relationships down, thinking, God, yeah, I did. Me and him were there for a couple of days on the stairwell.
I just think that no one really. This is why I think the Britpop era sort of so baffled me, because I was very used to being on a scene where, yeah, there's lots of people who are really creative. They don't really think of themselves as famous. Do you know what I mean? I don't think Billy Childish thinks of himself as someone who needs a limo to drop him off at a gig. Do you know what I mean? Or would ever want that. You know what I mean? But I just think that. I just, I mean, I don't know. I just, it didn't really occur to me that, I used to know like such and such before they were famous. Well, everybody did, it was a big scene. I'm sure if you talk to anyone from that scene, they've got loads of names that they could mention because those people were just there. There was just a very, very thriving underground scene. If you were going to see My Bloody Valentine, like I say, it would be a quid to get in. It wasn't some fancy VIP area with a guest list and only 2 people get to go backstage. It's just happening in some crappy college and they're mingling and hoiking their gear in and out. I mean, there's no starry kind of, oh, I'm an important person. They're just at the bar of a pub,
Well, I know. Well, I remember them at the Art Centre and Silverfish were supporting. And again, it's like, oh, yes, they're good. They're a good band, And again, they end up having 5 years and, and Leslie goes on to do an amazing solo career as well. So, yeah, and it was probably £2 to get in or some ridiculously overinflated or 150 probably. But reading the book, because there's the London scene and the North London world that looks very exciting. But then when you start talking about your American experience, that sounds quite hideous. Almost, I haven't seen the film, but Woodstock 99 is one of those ones that does sound kind of brutal. And you were hanging out with people that egos, they weren't Kevin Shields, were they? Or, they weren't the English kind of introspective, slightly embarrassed quality. They were just massive men with massive egos.
I mean, that was very, very much, I suppose with the Lollapalooza, there was a bit of that. Honestly, 90% of the people on that tour I thought were great. Do you know what I mean? And America, I think what's different is it was somehow more like they took their music more seriously. There was a kind of, but it was still quite down at heel. I mean, the Flaming Lips were touring in a minibus, you know what I mean? And Babes in Toyland were real muckers in. I mean, there was no kind of starry attitude. I think Lollapalooza was very different because it was just this kind of my first experience of that level of kind of, money and organisation and huge sort of stadiums and this, that and the other. But it's necessarily like that. And actually most of the people were very down to earth and not like that at all. I think what I could see is by the time, we were in our last year, and there's those kind of radio festivals and stuff like that, I could see that sort of what would become that kind of Woodstock 99 stuff sort of creeping in. Like you could see that kind of corporate invasion, because when we did Lollapalooza, alternative music was still alternative music.
Right.
It was underground. And then it just, I think, up post kind of, probably sort of Nirvana and things like that, not that I'm blaming them, but I think that's when the money men realised that there was real proper money to be made here and they just pounced on it. And I think that just changed the whole kind of, the whole setup and even the way the fans were treated. And do you know what I mean? And the bands were just a production line. Like I just felt like, this is all about, and like no one's really interested in the money. It's the band or the music,
right?
It's all about hits, big tour, throw stuff against the wall, whatever sticks you go with. Everything else is just swept aside. Just not my world. I went into music for a lot of my tribe. I know it's a bit over romanticized, but that kind of your tribe, your people, your kind of creatives and people who don't give a crap about that sort of stuff, like limos and groupies and all of that. That's the stuff we were rejecting, and suddenly that all came into.
Yes, it did. It did sound very testosterone. When you were writing the book about Lush, did you find yourself having to reprocess that experience of Lush, the early years after, because you had the reunion, which didn't go terribly well. Did Lush become a like over that period, over the after night at 15? Did it feel like a subject that you never wanted to think about again? And then doing the book, you were able to process and look at some of the nicer times and the more innocent moments of when the band were first getting together.
I mean, it's quite difficult to write about that stuff when you know what's coming. It does cast a bit of a pall. And, the reunion, I mean, to be honest, the reunion was a real success in terms of, actually what Lush did and putting us back on the map. And it was great. It was just the personal stuff that was difficult. And so looking back at kind of Lush's early history, even, it's quite, once you know how those relationships are going to collapse, it was quite difficult to sort of try and just reset to, you know what I mean, to what it was like when we were sort of all really good mates and everything was brilliant. I'm not sure I entirely succeeded, and partly because, like I said, I didn't. I kind of think, look, take it as read that, you only have to look at a handful of interviews or see us playing or whatever. You can tell that we got on. We were friends. Do you know what I mean? We've got a long history and all of that. But I do find it a bit dull reading books that are, don't really. I just think it's more. This might be my personality. I just think it's more interesting to hear about the trials and the tribulations and how you got through them, and that's more amusing than bragging about how amazing you were and how every gig you played people were like throwing themselves at you and and we were such great mates and it was good fun. I know it's like lovely to remember that, but it just doesn't. I think it makes for quite boring reading. So I do worry that it's a little bit underbelly heavy, but I just think that's more interesting and funnier, actually.
Yes, it does. Yes, there is those elements. It was just that the fact that reading the book, it sounds like towards that when the band finishes the first time, that everybody is just exhausted and is just looking to need a sleep, really. Did you, looking back, feel that the last album and the last kind of moments before it kind of finished, was it quite hard work being in the band at that stage?
I mean, it was always hard work being in the band. It's just that, the hard work can be enjoyable when it's, you're, I mean, look, going to America and you're with your mates and you've got a crew and you're in a different city every night and it's really, really good fun, and making records is great. It is work, but it's really enjoyable. I think what happened is probably a bit of a perfect storm. I mean, me and Emma were kind of like, and Chris was sort of, turning 30 or about to. It's quite a tricky age. It starts to wear a bit thin being away from home for like 6 months of the year and slogging around different countries. And, that is the age where you start to worry about, well, hang on a minute, it was all very well doing this in my 20s for bugger all money. But, you start to think about whether you want to have children, how you're going to be able to pay to settle down. I mean, the thought of touring, I know certain women like Kristen Hirsch always did it. The idea of going on tour with my children would have just been anathema. There's absolutely no way I could have done that. So it's a bit of a life change time. I think the whole of that industry had changed. 4AD had changed. There was so much going on around us. And that treadmill, that expectation of just play until you get a hit. Hits. That was the Britpop thing. Write a hit. It needs to get on top of the pops. It needs to get in the charts. Well, that was never what 4AD was about before that. I think that, that's partly why Ivo got out. Like the whole industry just started to change in a way that he didn't recognise. And I didn't really, none of us really liked that. And you're made to feel like a bit of a loser for not wanting that, for not being really hungry for that. It's just a completely, it's not, if that's what the music industry had been when I was 16, 17, 18, and when me and Emma first decided to start a band, I wouldn't have done it. If that had been the environment, I just wouldn't have done it. I'd have done something else.
Yes, but obviously, I mean, it's just that, there's quite a few grim, really grim moments in the book. But Chris is obviously one of those ones which is just kind of heartbreakingly sad. I mean, I just wondered how you kind of process that over not just the time, but now looking back on it and just, it's, I think Amelia Fletcher, her brother, who was in the band Heavenly, he killed himself. And I just wondered how you sort of navigate through that kind of episode, yourself, and then having to sort of write about it again.
Actually, was Amelia in... She's not the one who was in Tallulah Gosh, is she?
Yes, so she was in Tallulah Gosh and then Heavenly. And
Do you
then...
know what? Because at the time of Chris's death, I think I actually corresponded with her a bit. And yeah, I think I wrote to her mother and she wrote back. So I'd sort of forgotten about that. I mean, it was such an awful, awful time. I think looking back again, it's not like I've ever stopped really talking about it or thinking about Chris. So writing about it wasn't kind of like what am I trying to say? It wasn't like I'm like going back and thinking about something that I hadn't thought about in 25 years or whatever, but trying to sort of convey the rawness of how it felt right then was... I don't want to sound melodramatic, but I was sitting here like for a week sobbing. Every time Moose came back from work, I'd be sitting here like, oh God, sort of wailing, and he'd be like giving me a hug because it was just really just so terrible to remember, that time and the suddenness of it and remembering how it affected everyone, and I didn't want it to be a kind of... I think it was just so important to get Chris's personality over in the rest of the book, and what a great bloke he was, but a flawed bloke like all of us,
yes,
sort of like, so that you kind of feel like you know him a bit before that terrible thing happens. And I think because that is not who he was. I think sometimes people look back at Chris and they go, oh my God, the tragic drummer from Lush who, took his own life. That's not who he was. That was just this terrible, terrible day. You know what I mean? And it's sort of, without wanting to remove the impact of that clearly, but also not just defining him by that moment, I just felt was really important.
Yes. Did you, when you were asked to do the book, I think you said your initial response was no way. Was it kind of not wanting to go back in it, or was it this sort of thinking, God, that would be really difficult because, as you said, the members of the band don't really communicate, and there's probably stuff that would be a bit tricky. Was that something that you had to work out and navigate, how you were going to sort of try and write a good book about your life and the band while not sort of unearthing all these other issues that came up?
I mean, yeah, I had to tread quite carefully. I think, to be honest with you, the initial reason I didn't want to do it is because I just thought no one would be bloody interested. I was really like, who the fuck is going to care that Miki from Lush has written a book, really? But it was the publisher that was convincing me, there's like, lots of music books now, people in all sorts of obscure bands are writing books. So I thought, okay, fair enough, you know what I mean? But as you say, I just... I think when the sample chapter they asked me to write to see, whether they were genuinely going to be interested, I wrote about Lollapalooza. And I think when I first wrote it, there was still a lot of what ends up in the book. But Peter, the publisher, did come back to me and said, yes, you're very nice about everyone. And I thought, uh-oh. Is he saying I'm being too nice? And there is a temptation, that you don't want to upset anyone. So you feel like... you just end up sort of whitewashing everyone, really. And I thought, well, actually, that's not really how it was, and I'm not even saying revealing anything terrible about them, but even just sort of little petty things, which I do actually think bring those characters more to life.
Yes.
Those are the more interesting things. Everybody knows Eddie Vedder's a lovely guy. Everybody knows blah, blah, blah. Do you know what I mean? And actually just reiterating that the whole time is just a bit name droppy, because then it just becomes, oh yeah, look at me, I had a conversation with, Mark Gardner from Ride, or yeah, I hung out with the Flaming, you know what I mean? So unless you've got something interesting to say, it doesn't have to be nasty, but I just thought, you know, there were sort of little quirky moments that I think, you know, I hope no one's offended. I hope no one in the book sort of thinks like, oh my God, I can't believe she said that about me. But, you know, I think people are probably a bit thin-skinned. I don't know how I'd react if someone wrote about me like that. So I'm not even going to say like, you know.
I think it is, yeah, it's a bit surreal, I guess, isn't it? When you see yourself and go, oh, interesting.
Well, you know, because actually when you meet people, and most of these people you meet quite briefly, you know what I mean? On one tour, you know, you might spend sort of 9 weeks in close contact with them, but after that, it's sort of pretty, you know, rare. And that person, you know, the way I was writing about a lot of these people was just how they were at that time. They might be completely different people. They might have been totally different even then to a different person. How they responded to me might be as much my fault as theirs if it's a negative experience. Do you know what I mean? And I just think, you know, the one thing I worry about this book coming out is people sort of taking things out of context and going like, oh, I knew they were a dickhead or whatever, and that's not what the book is. It really isn't. It's, yes, I might have had like brushes with people where you go, oh my God, that sounds awful, but that was that person in those 5 minutes that I met them, you know. Yes. I'm not into sort of like some Me Too kind of terrible revelations of people so that they could be buried. It's absolutely not.
Well, I guess it actually, the time when Lush were at, you know, your sort of pop stardom or whatever that is, it was when the lad culture was at its height as well. So there was a lot of kind of lads had sort of become to the fore again, hadn't they? The loaded generation with, you know, champagne, cocaine and sort of acting. Because I do remember a documentary where you talk about Alex James biting your bum and thinking, God, that was a bit tacky, wasn't it?
I mean, to be fair to him, I think he texted Emma after that was screened, apologising. I don't think he could. Certainly don't think he remembered it, but he did apologise. But I did think, well, 20 years too late, but never mind. Anyway, but but you know, I think, and I do think the problem I had with that, a lot of that lad culture. Look, I get it. Loads of people had a good time, but it kind of like made it acceptable to behave in a certain way that actually just really pissed me off. Other people, maybe it didn't bother them. In fact, I know it didn't bother a lot of people, but I just found, again, I went into music, not that everyone was really po-faced and right on in the 80s, but, you know, there was a understanding that we are the alternative. Like big rock stars might act like that, but we don't. This is a different world, okay? And there's a certain way of behaving. Not that there wasn't bad behavior then, but it was just generally sort of sneered at, and look at that dickhead over there. And I think with Britpop it became like, okay, everyone can act like that. Everyone can like grope and go, you know, and sort of like, what the fuck, you know, what were kind of, you know, things that you put up with in the 80s, but those were the kind of mainstream, the normies, the hooray Henrys, the bankers, the wankers, do you know what I mean? And now it was all in right there in the middle of it, you know. So I didn't have a huge sense of humour about it. Okay,
no. Absolutely. No, you couldn't imagine the crowd at the June Brides being a bit rowdy and gropey, could you?
No shit. Yeah.
Dear old Phil Wilson. So when, just as you were sort of bringing the book together, did you, or did your editor, did you sort of go, oh, shall we do the reunion, or shall we just stop there, right there, and just think about that as part 2 if we ever do that?
I mean, I think the reunion was very raw. I think, again, you know, if I wrote about it, I would have to write about it warts and all. And I just don't think that, I think it would cause too many problems. And I think the other thing, to be honest, that stops me from writing about a later period is that I've got kids, and they, you know, one of my kids is like, don't mention me ever, and the other one is like totally fine about it. But I still think I'm not comfortable talking about
Yes.
them too much. Do you know what I mean? Like, who knows how they'll feel in a decade? And I don't know. It just makes me uncomfortable. But yes, I think the reunion was just too raw. I'm not going to lie, it's a pretty good story, but like it would just cause way too many problems, I think. Yeah.
Yes. I was wondering how you were going to. I did notice in a way the book, that Phil doesn't get a lot of chat. He just gets a couple of very quick mentions and just move on. And I just wondered if that was kind of just being diplomatic.
Possibly. I mean, to be honest, I think again, having I chose to write about like recording Spooky in some detail. I didn't really want to sit there and revisit every album we did, and unless it was funny, like the Split stuff, I just thought was funny, rather than kind of like, oh yeah, and this is how we recorded that, and blah blah blah, and this is when he played that bass line, and this, that, and the other. So, I think a lot of by the time you get Phil in the band, I've kind of covered what it's like to go on tour and what it's like to be in a studio, and what it's like to play gigs and all that. So by the time he's in, it's kind of a lot of that stuff is up and running. So it does become a bit more about the industry as a whole, and and kind of how we slotted into that, rather than a sort of massive description of everybody's personality. But yes, you're right. I mean, I didn't want to, I'm sure that Phil might feel uncomfortable if I talked too much about I mean, the good and the bad. There's things about Phil that I would have loved to have written, but I don't want to tread on his kind of personal history. So that was always a consideration. There's stuff that I wanted to write about Emma, but I just thought, I don't know if she'd be, and nice stuff, like I say, things that I think would have been really interesting for people to know, but I didn't want to get in some legal battlefield where it's like, well, you can't put this, you can't put that, and I was fucking running out of time. I'm not going to lie. It was getting to the point where it was like, right, come on, and I just thought I need to just, kind of.
So unlike putting an album out and just wondering if the critics and fans like it, putting a book out, are you having how are you dealing with the one day that's going to be out there on the bookshelves, on Amazon and in people's lives? I mean, yes, I just wondered, are you preparing yourself for this moment?
Yes, I'm mostly spending it in a deep state of panic, actually, and drinking quite a lot to numb that. I don't know what it's like to have a book out. I don't know what it's like to sit there and do Q&As about your book. I don't know what it's like I don't know what reviewers are like, whether they put the boot in or I have no idea. This is all new territory for me. So I tend to always fear the worst, which is why I sort of.
Well, I guess it's all our default, isn't it? Just assume the worst and then just be relieved.
Don't. Some people think they're going to set the world alight. I mean, I've never really been like that.
I haven't. Sort of, if I can have a good night's sleep, it's a success, really, isn't it? Yeah. So I just wondered how you were sort of like, God, it's all out there, or most of it it's in print, and it's going to be.
I mean, the one thing I think that has really like bolstered me is that the feedback I've had that's positive off people who have read it, including kind of journalists and things, is that they do really praise the writing. And so I kind of feel like, well, if the writing stands up, it's not just about the content. It's not just about, well, you're only reading this to get sort of revelations. But if it's actually a good read and interesting and well written, that actually means quite a lot more to me. If I'm honest, because then I think it was a worthwhile thing to do for an artistic reason, as po-faced as that sounds. Do you know what I mean?
Well, I think it's one of those things you want, in a way, you want to hope that people are going to say, yeah, well, you can write well, rather than, oh, that was a dreadful bit of writing. I think that would be whether
interesting story, but the writing's crap. That would have, that would have been like not great for me. And I just think, it's a bit like, oh yeah, Lush, interesting. She's got red hair. they look quite good, but the music's rubbish, right? No one wants that, right? And so I feel a bit like that about the book. Like, if the writing's good and the writing's solid, then I think, okay, great, I'll take that.
Well, I have to say, 9-8 books is, I mean, every book they brought out has just been really interesting. So they seem to be on a very good moment, don't they? Let's face it. I mean, they've all been a bit of a page turner, and like there was another one, The World of Twists, the band, which, to be honest, I didn't really remember much about at all, and it's still a good read. So I think they've certainly picked some good subjects. So I think I was, just on a personal level, I was really mesmerized by it, and I thought the childhood stuff was just like incredible, because you don't normally get that much in a book about if it's about someone connected to music talking about that childhood. But it's like, blimey, that's quite the story. So I think on that level, I know I love those sort of stories. So I could fill your boots, really, isn't it? But it is good. It's amazing and just very revealing. So yeah, I think it's fantastic. So I think you must be so pleased. But good luck with it, because it's a hell of a thing to put out there, and to then just experience, really, and realize that people will be opening it on Christmas Day.
Yeah, well, ask me on like the book's out on the 29th of September, so you can ask me how I feel on the 30th. All right? And that will be a more accurate feedback, probably. At the moment, I am sort of a bit fifth. I mean, I'm excited. I am excited, but I just I literally don't know what to expect. I think that's what's slightly terrifying.
Yes, and just as briefly, you are you still making music with the new band, by the way?
With Piroshka, yes. So I think, once all the promo for this book is out of the way, I can crack on with making another Piroshka record.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Indeed. There you go. That's me in conversation with Miki, talking about her life in Lush, and as she just mentioned, new material coming out with Piroshka. But the book that we were talking about, fingers crossed, this is out in September 2022 on 9-8 books, so do check it out, and also look at the other books that are being published. And this has been the C86 Show, David Eastaugh. If you want to contact me, you can on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, just do C86 Show. Also, these have all been archived, aren't you lucky? You can find those on Spotify, iTunes, Podbean, and probably elsewhere. Anyway, have a great week and stay safe.